This video was brought to you by Insights, a platform to review and coach from the comfort of your own PC. Simply upload, review, and start strategizing, all in real time. See why the pros are using Insights to organize and review their gameplay. Get your free account today.
Thanks to Insights for supporting this series. We're going to use Insights later on in the episode to analyze some gameplay footage. Make sure to check out the link in the description if you are interested in trying out Insights for yourself. Hey, ioStux's here. I'm a professional Overwatch coach with 3 years of experience, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of my complete Bronze to Owl guide. If you want to learn more about who I am and what this show is about, make sure to check out the first episode. For more details, I'd also recommend reading through the video description. Movement is one of the most fundamental mechanics in the game, and it's a relatively simple one at that. While Overwatch has very responsive movement compared to other games like Counter-Strike or Team Fortress, for example, the fundamental rules of movement apply to any game you play. In today's episode, I'd like to cover all the relevant concepts that you need to know about if you want to master movement in any game. I will structure this episode a bit differently. Previously, I would cover all the concepts first and then go over examples at the end. Due to the nature of this video's topics, however, we will do things a bit differently. What I'll do instead is show appropriate examples for each subject as I explain them. That should make what I'm talking about a bit easier to visualize. We will cover multiple significant topics in depth, including what I like to call the fundamental movement transaction. We will go over strafing, pathing, and peek shooting. We will address enemy movement, jumping, crouching, and freezing. I'll share my thoughts on WASD aiming, and finally go over character-specific movement options and how they affect your movement overall. Where relevant, I will showcase appropriate examples of both bad movement and good movement to help you better understand how you can actively improve your own movement. The fundamental movement transaction is one of the most important concepts when it comes to movement. It's relatively simple, but its implications are significant. At its most basic, it states that your movement cannot make you both easier to hit, while also making it easier for you to hit your targets. The more difficult of a target you become due to your movement, the more difficult it would be for you to land your shots. On the other hand, the easier your shots become, the easier it will be for the enemy to hit you as well. That is the basis upon which most of your movement-related decisions in-game rest. Movement, for the most part, is finding the perfect trade-off between increased effectiveness and increased safety. If your movement becomes too erratic and fast, you'll have a difficult time actually landing shots. But if you stand still, while landing shots will become significantly easier, you're also making yourself an easy target to hit. It comes down to what you need for the situation. Say you're finding yourself out of position and you are being pressured by multiple opponents at once, standing out in the open. In this situation, you would want to prioritize safety to buy your teammates time to force out any threats and to give them a chance to save you. You would want to move as erratically as possible. While you won't be able to land shots as easily, staying alive is more important to you than being effective. On the other hand, let's say you are sneaking up on an enemy Widowmaker who hasn't noticed you as Tracer. In this case, you don't have to worry about making yourself a difficult target to hit. No one is looking at you. But you instead want to prioritize landing your shots, since you can one-clip her before she or her team has the time to react. You really have to analyze each situation. If you were missing crucial shots, look at your movement. Were you moving more erratically than you needed to? Or maybe you died because you weren't moving enough, making yourself an easy target. Another important concept to understand is how difficulty scales with movement. This is going to be a bit complex, so don't hesitate rewatching this section if it doesn't make sense straight away. Landing shots on a target is all about reacting to how they are moving. The more predictable their movement becomes, the easier it is to land shots. If they aren't moving at all, you do not have to move your crosshair at all. That's state 0. Landing shots in this state is trivial. State 1 is either party moving in a single dimension. For example, if you are standing still and the enemy moves side to side, aiming is more difficult than if they were standing still. But it's still fairly predictable. If they are moving to the right, there are only really two options they have. They can either stop their movement or they can change directions. This makes tracking and predicting their movement much simpler. Say, if you're standing still and the enemy is moving, on your screen he would go from not moving to going right at a regular speed, to going left at a regular speed, to going right at a regular speed, to standing still, to going right again, not moving, going left, not moving, going right, and so on and so on. Keep in mind that this sequence of movements is fairly complex. In the majority of situations, the enemies will simply alternate between moving right and left at a constant speed and rhythm. I will go into that a bit later on in the chapter on enemy movement. But once we enter stage 2, things become complicated. In this state, both you and your target are strafing while looking at each other. You might think that this wouldn't really make a huge difference and that it wouldn't make aiming that much more difficult, but quite the opposite. If either party moves on their own, aiming is fairly manageable. But as soon as both parties move, the way your target moves on the screen becomes a lot less predictable. Previously, the only states the enemy could be in was moving left at regular movement speed, moving right at regular movement speed, or standing still. If we add our movement to the mix, there are a lot more states to think about. For example, if we are moving in the same direction as the opponent, we are negating any relative screen movement since we are not moving relative to each other. But if we are moving in opposite directions from each other, your target is moving at twice the relative velocity than if you were standing still. For example, the enemy could go from not moving to moving to the right, until you move to the left, at which point him moving to the right gets amplified, and he moves to the right even faster on your screen. Then he changes directions while you stop strafing, maybe to move forward or just to stand still. Then he goes back to the right, but now you're going to the right as well, so your movements negate each other, and he doesn't appear to be moving at all on your screen. But then he changes directions, and now instead of negating, your movements are opposite each other, so they amplify, and he goes zipping to the left of your screen, forcing you to make a huge flick. But then he goes to the right again, and so on and so on. You see where this is going. Predicting the enemy movement is a challenge in of itself, even with most opponents strafing rhythmically and predictably, but when you add your own movement to the equation, your movement will go from lining up to not lining up multiple times a second. The speed at which your target moves across the screen will vary constantly. Sometimes he'll go left, sometimes right, sometimes he won't move at all, sometimes he'll go fast, and sometimes your target moves slowly. Hitting a target that moves to the left, then to the right, then to the left, then to the right in a predictable rhythm is one of the easier situations. But if your target moves like that while you are strafing as well, even though both of you are moving very predictably, the interaction between you two won't be predictable because you won't be in sync. Two predictable movement patterns turn into a very complex movement pattern that is unpredictable in real time. You also have to keep in mind the speed at which our target moves across the screen in state 1 compared to state 2. If the enemy target moves to our right while we are stationary, it will do so at a fixed base speed. But if it moves to our right while we move to the left, it moves to the right of the screen much faster. So there are multiple downsides. Not only does it become less predictable when the enemy will switch directions on our screen, or even that our movements can cancel each other out, adding another situation we have to account for when the enemy moves. When the enemy moves, they will also move across the screen much quicker. I cannot overstate the difficulty difference between state 1 and state 2. All of this adds a lot of variability that makes it difficult to track targets or predict where you need to flick. Let me show you a little experiment that visualizes this concept a bit easier. The double pendulum. If we look at a traditional pendulum, its movement is simple and predictable. It swings from side to side, and you can predict where it'll be fairly easily, similar to how when only the enemy is moving at state 1. But if we look at a double pendulum, we have an additional variable in the system that doesn't make it more difficult to predict what will happen to the tip of the pendulum. It makes it essentially impossible. The first pendulum moves side to side like normal in a regular rhythm, and in this case the joints are aligned at the start, so the chaos doesn't begin until a little bit later into the animation. But as soon as the second joint gets out of sync, the movement of the lower pendulum becomes chaotic. Of course, movement isn't the same as a pendulum swinging around, and both players strafing as they are dueling each other doesn't make movement completely impossible to predict. But the difference in difficulty when it comes to landing shots on targets does rise dramatically if both players are affecting their movements relative to each other rather than only one player. So what does all of this tell us? Do not underestimate the impact that your movement has on the game and your overall mechanical performance. One of the most common misconceptions that I have seen amongst lower level players is that they were simply bad at aiming. But that isn't the case at all. Some of them are fairly competent at getting their crosshair to where they want it to be, but they make life unnecessarily difficult for themselves with their own movement. They aren't fighting against the opponent's movement. Oftentimes they are fighting against their own movement, and if they would learn how to adjust their movement patterns during a round based on the circumstances, they could dramatically increase their accuracy and survivability without spending a single second aim training. When we talk about mechanics, we don't refer to aim on its own. We are always referring to both aim and movement at the same time, because they go hand in hand. You cannot become competent at aiming without being competent at movement as well. Strafing is fairly simple. You move side to side. The reason you move side to side is because it maximizes the relative movement speed to whoever you are trying to dodge. If you move in a circle, for example, then your movement becomes more predictable as the relative velocity to your target changes predictably. When you quickly change directions while strafing, you make it more difficult for the enemy to adjust. But if you're moving in a straight line, a curve, or a circle, you're making aiming easier for the opponent since they don't have to adjust the speed or direction of their crosshair as abruptly as against a strafing target. AD strafing is the most effective movement option you have when you want to maximize your survivability, but it also affects your own aiming the most, as we outlined in the previous topic. While the actual rhythm of the strafe matters, in most situations it isn't always possible to fully focus on keeping your movement unpredictable, but I will address this later on in the video. One of the most common habits amongst lower players is a symptom called WS strafing. It's quite fascinating, so let me fill you in. Most players have heard of AD strafing and that it's something they should do. Players instinctively know that standing still is bad because it makes them easier to hit. The problem is that the players don't fully understand how strafing actually makes them more difficult to hit, which is the main cause of WS strafing. So on one hand, your instincts are telling you to keep on moving, so you're a more difficult target to hit. But on the other hand, your mind realizes that landing shots becomes more difficult as you strafe. The two sides fight, being a difficult target to hit and landing shots consistently. The fundamental movement transaction I explained earlier isn't intuitive, so most players who don't think about it don't really want to do both things at once. They want to move, but they also want to avoid missing shots. And that's when WS strafing happens. WS strafing is simple. Instead of moving side to side by pressing the A and D keys, you move forwards and backwards using the W and S keys. This way, you get the instinctive feeling of safety because you aren't standing still, but your aim doesn't deteriorate either, so it manifests itself as a habit. But if you think about it, WS strafing is terrible. The reason why WS strafing doesn't negatively affect your aim is because it doesn't affect the relative position of your opponent on the screen. If you place your crosshair on the enemy's head and you start pressing W or S, your crosshair will remain on the enemy's head. And thanks to the fundamental movement transaction, since WS strafing doesn't make aiming any more difficult for you, it also doesn't make it any more difficult for the enemy. So WS strafing in a one-on-one situation is no more effective than standing still. In the context of a game, it helps you dodge shots that are being spammed at you from the sides, but proper positioning will make that unnecessary in most situations. WS strafing is fairly easy to spot. Just open up a replay and monitor your movement during stressful situations. If you are below plat, chances are you'll find some WS strafing at some point during the gameplay. Next, let's talk about rhythmic strafing. You can make your strafing slightly more difficult to deal with by using it to actively dodge or juke enemy shots and projectiles. The best example are low fire rate weapons like Roadhog's shotgun or Hanzo's arrows. During teamfights, players want to maximize their damage output, which means firing their weapons as often as possible. The downside of this is that the firing rate will remain constant, making them easy to predict. Rhythmic strafing is catching onto the enemy's firing rate, either through visual or audio cues, and changing directions when the enemy is about to fire a shot. This way, you can actively dodge enemy shots. This won't work for very extended duels, as the enemy will most likely catch on to what you're doing eventually. But very few engagements last long enough for an opponent to catch onto your movement patterns and adjust. Rhythmic strafing obviously won't do much against characters like Soldier, Tracer, or Zarya, but it is a very strong technique against characters like McCree, Hanzo, Roadhog, or Ashe, who fire individual shots in a slow, predictable pattern. Mirror strafing is another fairly advanced technique that you shouldn't focus on too early, but which can be very powerful later on. If you're confident in your ability to win a 1v1, you might want to force the enemy into a situation where landing shots is easy. For example, if you are playing McCree and you are in a 1v1 against another McCree, but you have a Mercy pocketing you while the enemy McCree doesn't, you might not want to be in an engagement with a low chance to hit. Let's say you are in a 1v1. Both of you are strafing erratically, which makes it nigh impossible for either player to predict the other player's movement. At this point, the fight will come down to the player's aim. Aim is inconsistent, so even if you aim better on average than the other player, you might miss a shot or two, and he might hit a shot or two. So despite the pocket, there is a high chance that he can still win the 1v1 in case he lands some lucky shots while you miss yours. But you know that if both of you would have an aimbot, aka land 100% of your shots, you would win the 1v1 since you have a Mercy supporting you. So you want to make it as easy as possible for both of you to land shots. But that can be tough if the enemy is strafing erratically. So you want to negate their movement, since being in a 1v1 where landing shots is easy is preferable. You want to catch onto the rhythm of their strafe and strafe in sync with them. This makes your strafes cancel out and the relative velocity between you two. So landing shots is as easy as if both targets are standing still. This way, you can reduce inconsistency when aiming and decrease the chances that the other player hits some lucky shots while you miss yours, causing you to lose a 1v1 despite your own pocket healer. Lastly, let's talk about strafe length. Another very common issue in lower ranks especially is that their strafe movements are way too quick. The problem is that if you strafe too quickly, you are essentially standing in place, negating any defensive benefits that strafing would provide you. When strafing, aim for a tempo of around 140 beats per minute. Keep in mind that these are averages. While you ideally want to make your movement less predictable, especially during hectic teamfights, you can't always keep your movement truly random. In most stressful situations, you will end up strafing in a rhythm, because that is the easiest strafe to maintain without putting any conscious effort into it. And in most fights, there are some more important things to worry about than how unpredictable your strafing is. You want to avoid strafing too slowly. 60 beats per minute is a fairly common strafing speed amongst some players. The reason why someone would strafe slowly is because it makes aiming less difficult than faster strafes. The problem is that slower strafing forces the enemy to react to your change in direction less frequently, allowing them to hit their shots more consistently. One of the most common issues is strafing too fast, however. Quite frequently, you see, especially lower rank players, strafing at speeds of 480 beats per minute and beyond. At this speed, you get the same effects of the slow 60 beats per minute strafe. You aren't really strafing, you're vibrating. which makes aiming easier, which is another reason why players tend to strafe too fast or too slow. It has less of a negative effect on your own accuracy. But the whole point behind strafing is to make yourself a difficult target to hit. So the more annoying your movement is to your own aiming, the more annoying it'll be to the enemy's aiming. Being aware of your strafing speed and adjusting it to your needs is a good way of controlling your defensive and offensive capabilities for each situation. Strafing will be difficult at first if you aren't used to strafing at an appropriate speed, but it's something you will get used to over time, whereas the average player won't know how to deal with an effective strafe like that. So your aim will get better, while the opponents will get worse, allowing you to climb.
So this is the first clip that we're going to take a look at. The main thing to look out for here is the lack of strafing. I'm going to let this clip play first, just so you get an opportunity to kind of look at what the main issues are with this player's movement.
I was like the only one on point. Yeah, me and we're coming. Group up.
Okay, so I think that was enough. So of course the main issue with this player's movement is a complete lack of strafing. Now, deciding to walk in straight line like he did is not necessarily always a bad play, but Tracer especially is a very, very squishy character. So moving in straight lines like that and not strafing in the middle of a team fight can be very, very dangerous. Some of the worst examples I'm going to point out in just a moment. So this is where the clip started. At the start, the player actually showed a habit called WS strafing, which is something that I'm going to go into a little bit later into the guide, where, you know, instead of strafing left to right, he just strafes back and forth, which doesn't really do anything. But then during the fight, he just keeps moving in straight lines, which makes him a very, very easy target to kill if anyone on the enemy team would focus him. So right here, he's walking back. Right here, when he goes for the Zenyatta, instead of kind of catching himself and getting back into a strafe pattern, he just goes for it's technically a mirror strafe, but again, it's very, very risky to mirror strafe as Tracer, especially if the opponent's movement is this slow. So the Zenyatta is moving in a straight line and our player moves in a straight line. This right here with the D.Va is probably one of the worst examples. As our player shoots the D.Va, he just walks in a straight line to the left. And that is extremely dangerous. In this case, the enemy team isn't really focusing him, but this is one of those habits that if he can't get rid of it, if he plans on climbing, he's going to have a lot of trouble. Right, so this is another clip that we're going to look at. This is actually a good example of rhythm strafing. So if we let this clip play,
I need to be careful about the Roadhog, like he might be already camping up somewhere.
you can see that Kabaji is moving towards the left and he meets the Roadhog, and obviously he gets hooked.
Yeah, he's up here. Unlucky.
And shot, but fortunately this doesn't kill him, so he has some time to react now, and I want you to pay close attention to everything that's going on over the next few seconds.
He's already camping. ioStux's!
Okay, so this is a beautiful example of rhythm strafing for multiple reasons. For one, Roadhog's rate of fire is not the fastest, it's not the slowest, but it's definitely possible to rhythm strafe, which means getting kind of a grasp on the rhythm that the enemy Roadhog is shooting in to know exactly when the next shot is coming. But what Kabaji does here is he also combines this with his healing field, which means that the longer he can keep this up, the more HP he's going to get. And he also mixes it with his strafe as soldier, which allows him to cross an even bigger distance, which makes it even more difficult for the enemy Roadhog to get an idea of what's going on. So I'm quickly going to replay this clip and pay special attention to the speed at which he actually moves.
I need to be careful about the Roadhog, like he might be already camping up somewhere. Yeah, he's up here. Unlucky. He was already camping. The jukes!
Right, so he strafes forward, he cancels it, he strafes forward, he cancels it, so on and so forth, and that makes him a very, very difficult target to hit from the enemy Rotork's perspective. This clip right here is another very classic example of very strong rhythm strafing, although this one is a little bit slower paced than the previous clip due to the different patches.
하나 정면 있고.
It's very similar to before, waiting for the shot and then going back. And it might seem very simple and straightforward, but coming up with this in the middle of a round can be very difficult, and only players that really have, where movement is really second nature to them, can consistently execute this. So the reason why this is a little bit more impressive than the last clip is because Effect not only correctly predicted when the Rotork was going to fire, the Rotork didn't actually fire in a clear rhythm either. It's a little bit difficult to hear for unexperienced ears, but the enemy Rotork was actually aiming his shots a little bit more carefully, probably because he was just taking his time, making sure that he could confirm the kill, and despite that, Effect could still properly predict that. And again, that's just a great example of very, very strong movement. And you don't necessarily need to play Soldier in order to do this. This works with essentially every other character as well. It's just a little bit easier with Soldier because his sprint allows him to be a little bit more unpredictable with his movement, because whenever he's walking forward, his movement speed is larger than when he's moving backwards, right? Okay, now let's combine a few different things. So this is a kind of a mixture of pathing, which I'm going to go into a bit, and the rhythm strafing that we've looked at before. And what makes this clip so interesting is that he is using the environment in order to predict what the enemy is going to predict and then counter that prediction. So I'm going to go into what that exactly means in just a moment. So we're just going to have a look at the clip first. So he's getting chased by the Genji. Right there. So the reason why this clip is so interesting is because in the previous clips with the Soldier juking, one of the main advantages that the Soldier players had is that they could use their sprint in order to adjust their movement speed, which makes it more difficult to predict. In this case, Effect doesn't have access to a sprint ability or any sort of movement altering option. So what he did was predict that the enemy was going to predict he is going to walk in a straight line around this corner, right? So Effect is escaping right now, which means that the enemy Genji thought, okay, he probably is going to go right around this corner as quickly as he can. But Effect didn't do that. You can see that as soon as he approaches the corner, he actually slows down, and instead of going towards the right as the enemy Genji expects, he's not going around the corner immediately. He predicts that shots are going to land there, and he actually moves towards the left first. So we can see right there how the bullets went towards, past his right. Right there. So the enemy Genji predicted, oh, he just wants to get around the corner as quickly as possible. I'm going to shoot right here at the corner, right? And this has multiple advantages because, for one, Effect obviously, jukes the shots, but this also buys him enough time to get another charge on his blink, which is very useful because now he doesn't have to worry about crossing this gap. He can simply blink around it if he wants to, although in this case, that isn't really super relevant. And now the last clip before we go into the next topic is, in my opinion, the most interesting example, because this is where we can see a player who has become so proficient at movement that he is actually capable to transfer those skills into his own personal life. So I'm just going to let the clip play, and I think it speaks for itself.
Die means like stand still and let them kill. I literally watched them through the walls doing this.
Right, so the reason why this strafing is so impressive is because not only is he strafing in a very unpredictable pattern side to side, he also does something that I'm going to address in a moment, where he tap crouches or crouch spams. So he is actively manipulating his head hitbox by using crouches in order to make it even more difficult to keep track of his body visually, which makes it more difficult for opponents to headshot him.
After I just told him to die.
Now he also uses another technique, which you can see in just a second.
I see you juking. Just die. I don't get it. Just stand still and die.
right there. So not only is he very good at crouch spamming and strafe spamming, his strafe pattern is also very unpredictable. So you could see that he was strafing at the start, and then he took a short break, which is called freezing, which is also something I'm going to address in a moment. And then he went right back to strafing again. And that again is just very, very difficult for to predict for, you know, enemy players.
This fucking AD crouch shit. Like, that's the opposite of dying, dude. And like, where's the race? Where's the race? Like, you guys are juke.
While the last two topics covered movement during actual encounters with the enemy, sometimes you want to reposition without actually getting into a one-on-one situation. That's what pathing is all about. It's about the best way to get from A to B based on the situation. There are two ways of getting from A to B. Let's say that you are playing corner A. Corner A is great, but your tanks start to push up and you no longer have any active line of sight with an enemy. You don't have anything to shoot, not even a shield, so you're forced to reposition to get back to applying pressure. You want to move up towards corner B. There are two ways to path to the next corner. You can reposition a straight line, or you can zigzag. It's about speed versus safety. If, for example, you feel confident that there are no active threats, then you want to prioritize speed over safety. You don't have anything that could be dangerous to you, so you want to get to the next corner as quickly as possible so you can go back to being effective. In this case, you'd move in a straight line for minimum travel time. But what if you need to reposition while being exposed to enemy fire? For example, maybe you are in the middle of a team fight and an enemy Ashe is starting to shoot at you and you have to hide. She has set her sights on you, and if you don't get to a different piece of cover, you will die to her. You want to get behind cover as quickly as possible, of course, but you also want to reach the cover alive. In this situation, you might prioritize zigzagging over moving in a straight line, but it depends on the situation. For example, if you are confident you can reach a safe position B before the enemy can kill you if you move along in a straight line, you want to do that. Sure, the enemy Ashe will hit you because you're moving in a straight line, which makes you an easy target to hit, but you'll be behind cover so quickly that even if she lands a shot, she won't be able to actually close out the kill. But let's say the distance to the safe position is a bit longer. In this case, moving in a straight line is not an option, because while you would reach the cover in shorter time, it would take long enough for the enemy Ashe to kill you if she lands all her shots. Since you don't want to rely on the enemy Ashe missing her shots on a target that moves in a straight line away from her, you want to sacrifice speed to make your movement less predictable. Combine a straight line with strafing and you get zigzagging. It'll increase the time it takes for you to get to your destination, but it will dramatically increase the chances of the enemy Ashe missing a shot, giving you a chance at getting behind cover in time. In episode 1 of this series, Positioning, I went into the importance of playing close to cover. This is one of the main reasons. It makes you less dependent on your mechanics, like movement or aim, to get out of tough situations alive, since you have an easier time avoiding or leaving unfavorable engagements. In the end, your movement during a fight will almost always be from corner to corner. Whether you are pushing up as Orisa, Ana or McCree, you want to hug the walls and get from corner to corner as quickly as possible. Exceptions like Doomfist exist, of course, but even then, if you find yourself without any cooldowns in the middle of the enemy team, you might have to zigzag your way behind cover, even with a character who has a lot of mobility. One small piece of advice for situations like this is that you want to try and turn away from the person shooting you and look at the ground. If we go back to our example of the McCree zigzagging his way behind cover to survive the enemy Ashe flank, you can choose to either face the Ashe while you walk backwards towards cover, giving you a chance to fight back and eventually even win the duel, or you can instead focus on survivability and turn your back towards her, looking downwards. This makes it much more difficult for the enemy to land a headshot on you, buying you extra time that can make the difference between you reaching a safe position alive or not.
All right, so let's go over some pathing examples now. So this clip is a very good example of pathing, mainly because it's not actually the player that we're going to be looking at who does the pathing really well. It's actually going to be an opponent. So in this case, the Widowmaker player Kabaji is chasing after an enemy Ana, and the enemy Ana is pathing perfectly. So first we're going to have a look at the clip, and then I'm going to try to break it down as best as I can.
Take one.
So in this case, the enemy Ana player knew that if she was just going to walk around the corner in a straight line, chances are that she's going to die anyways. Just 2 quick body shots by the Widowmaker alone would have been enough to kill her, because she doesn't have any sort of movement speed increasing abilities or any sort of mobility. So what she did is she used every tool in the box when it comes to pathing. She turned around, she pointed her gun downwards, which means that in this situation you can see that her head is actually untargetable. There's maybe a small sliver, a few pixels that could count as a headshot, but the chance of Kabaji landing a headshot on this Ana is very, very slim. Not only that, instead of opting for the straight route from this position around the corner, you can see that he's actually exposing himself to Kabaji, to the Widowmaker player, for an extended period of time, because he is strafing, right? He's zigzagging from his current position around the corner. But that is actually to his benefit, because if he walked in a straight line, Kabaji could just land a couple body shots and it would be over for this Ana. But because of the zigzagging, because of the turning around, by hiding the head hitbox, he manages to actually get out of the situation alive, which is, again, in my opinion, a perfect example of very strong pathing.
Take one.
Alright, because the last clip was already a very good example of pathing, I wanted to show you guys something a little bit different. So this is obviously a fairly old clip. This was within the first years of release. But in this case, the pathing isn't used to escape from an opponent. It is used to buy some time. So the soldier in this situation is going to get dragon bladed by the enemy Genji. And he knows that if he would just sprint away, chances are the Genji is simply going to catch up with the dash and he's going to be dead. So what he does instead is he uses his strong pathing abilities to juke the enemy Genji, to walk around corners. It's very similar to rhythm strafing, but it's more so about consistently breaking line of sight with the enemy Genji and only giving him very, very small windows of opportunity where he can actually do something. So right here, pay special attention to how he's using this wall right here, and then also this wall right here, in order to just go around back and forth over and over and over again. And again, it wasn't about escaping the Genji, it was simply about buying enough time in order for one of his teammates to help him. If the Roadhog wasn't here, then there's still a chance that the Genji could have just 1v1 the soldier afterwards and potentially lose that 1v1, depending on how well the soldier plays. But that's not really what it's about. Pathing is a lot about just buying yourself some time so that the enemy either makes a mistake or one of your teammates can save you. So this clip right here is an example of bad pathing for multiple reasons. For one, the player is going to jump. Now, the reasons why jumping might be bad is something that I'm going to go into later on in the episode, but his pathing is also fairly weak because he is not going to turn around. He is not going to use his movement abilities, and overall he's just giving the enemy that gets the jump on him a lot of time to potentially confirm a kill. So right here we can see that his pathing was very ineffective. For one, he wasn't actually hugging the wall, which means that he was taking a wider path than he could have taken, which means that he was exposed to the enemy Reaper for longer. He's also making life a little bit difficult because he is actually getting split from his team. Ideally, he shouldn't have walked around this corner. He should have actually gone and walked around this truck right here so he could stay closer to his team instead of putting himself into the situation with the Reaper. Of course, the jumping is also bad. It makes his movement very, very predictable, and it becomes very, very easy for the enemy Reaper to shoot him. And most importantly, While he was being chased down by the Reaper, he didn't turn around, he didn't use his sprint, he wasn't looking at the ground, although against Reaper that doesn't make the biggest difference. He was just staring the Reaper in the eye, jumping away from him and away from his team. This is a very good example of how to not react if a flanker is getting the jump on you, splitting yourself from your team, making your movement predictable, and essentially putting yourself into a corner.
Next, let's cover peek shooting. Peek shooting, at its core, is a technique to minimize exposure to enemy threats while you aren't able to fire. The most obvious example is going behind cover while reloading. After all, exposing ourselves to the enemy team without being able to shoot them is not necessary. But peek shooting can be used in between shots as well. Throwing out fire strikes as Reinhardt, spamming right clicks with Zarya, or firing Hanzo arrows are all situations in which peek shooting is very beneficial. It's about strafing in and out of cover to make sure that you are only exposing yourself when you absolutely have to. For example, let's say you are playing Reinhardt. Your shield breaks and you are forced to duck behind cover. You want to time your fire strike in a way that ensures that you are only leaving cover when the actual projectile is fired. Hanzo's arrows or Zarya's right clicks are even better examples. While you are drawing your arrow as Hanzo, you play behind cover, only exposing yourself to shoot. If you can visualize what's around the corner, you can position your crosshair beforehand, so you simply need to time your strafe and your shot properly to limit your exposure to a few single frames. The same goes for abilities like Junkrat's shots or Zarya's spam as well. Move in and out of cover to only peek whenever you are actually firing. This can be done with almost every character in the game. Widowmaker, McCree, Ashe, Zenyatta, Roadhog, and so on and so forth. This is especially useful in 1v1 situations. If you are in a duel against a McCree as Hanzo, your firing rate is lower than your opponent, which means that if you're standing opposite of each other, he can fire a shot while you are still charging up your shot. McCree fires 2.38 shots per second in the patch at the time of recording this video. Hanzo can fire an arrow every 1.3 seconds. It takes him 0.7 seconds to fully charge his arrow, and he has to wait 0.6 seconds after firing to charge up a new shot. That's less than 1 shot per second. So why would you want to let McCree fire bullets while you are still preparing your next shot? You don't. When dueling a McCree as Hanzo, you have to peek shoot if you want to stand a chance. Otherwise, missing a single shot could result in your death. You instead want to charge up your shot behind cover and only expose yourself when you have to fire your shot. This way, the McCree not only has to aim his shot properly, he also has to time it correctly in order to hit that small window of exposure you give him, instead of the constant exposure without peek shooting. If we take a moment to look at this visualization, keep in mind that this is not at all to scale, but this way it's much easier to visualize and explain. The top graph represents us as Hanzo firing our shots and moving in and out of cover. The bottom graph represents the enemy McCree's shots and the windows of opportunity that open up for him whenever we get out of cover. As you can see, we are charging up our shots while we are still behind cover, only moving out of cover when we are releasing our shot. This way, we are only exposing ourselves when we absolutely have to. The McCree can only shoot us while we are out of cover, represented by the black windows of opportunity. If the red line is at the bottom, it means the McCree can't shoot. If it is at its peak, it means he is ready to shoot. We can see that even when the McCree is ready to shoot, he has to wait for when we expose ourselves out of cover. We are forcing him to play to our own tempo. Normally, we would be able to fire many more shots than we do, but this way he can only shoot when we are shooting, which means that his fire rate is lowered to match ours. This is incredibly strong and useful on multiple characters, since Hanzo's shots individually are much more powerful than McCree's shots. Shield dancing is a different technique that isn't exactly peek shooting, but it's similar enough, so I wanted to put it in here. Moving around barriers properly is a skill in of itself. This doesn't have to be your own shield, any shield is fine, although stationary shields are preferred, like Orissa's barrier or Winston's bubble. Reinhardt's shield is too unpredictable. The technique is simple. You strafe around the barrier, consciously making sure that you are keeping it between you and the opponent to block the damage. It might sound like a niche skill, but assuming you are playing with your team, knowing how to properly shield dance is vital to having good movement.
Okay, so first of all, before we get into peak shooting, this is an excellent example of shield dancing by a Winston player using his own barrier.
나이스.
합치마!
루슈커. 아위더 필. 일로 와봐. 내려와봐. 윗선 내려와. 초월이야다.
못 내려와 지금. 나 점프.
So again, it is a fairly simple technique, and you don't necessarily need to have your own shield in order to execute this, but in general, just having a barrier and then making sure that you move in and out of cover, always keeping yourself at the opposite end of where the opponent is a very, very, very strong technique. And in this case, it most likely saved Miro's life, which can affect the outcome of a team fight significantly. So this is actually a bad example of how you shouldn't move. A player that not only messes up his strafing, but also misses out on the opportunity to abuse peak shooting. So he's playing Ashe, and Ashe is traditionally one of the stronger peak shooting heroes. If you don't know how to peak shoot properly as Ashe, you are going to be at a huge disadvantage. A lot of your deaths could be avoided, especially in the lower ranks, by learning how to properly peak shoot if you're an Ashe player. So we can see that the habit that this player has is that instead of moving towards, say, the right and then simply using the payload as cover and moving side to side, this player instead decides to completely abandon strafing, completely abandon the fact that he could abuse his range, and completely abandon cover, and he simply moves forward. And this is terrible, because while in lower ratings it is fairly difficult for the opponents to actually punish this sort of movement, because their aim, fundamentally speaking, is very weak. This sort of movement behavior, while it doesn't always prevent you from winning a game in lower ratings, is definitely going to prevent you from actually climbing, because as soon as the game puts you against opponents that are a little bit more mechanically skilled, you are going to struggle a lot. They're going to punish you for moving like this and not peak shooting. So again, he gets rezzed, he sees the payload, he could be using it, instead he runs past it, and he just walks straight at the McCree, making himself a very, very easy target. Alright, so this is a continuation of the last clip. This is actually the exact same player, the exact same VOD, and I wanted to show another clip from the same player in the exact same game to show you how fundamental these issues usually are, how fundamental this lack of understanding when it comes to movement usually is, and how it's not only a thing that happens once and it doesn't really impact the outcome of a game, but usually it's a habit that manifests itself in multiple situations, in multiple team fights, and has very negative effects. So I'm not going to explain exactly what's going on because I already did that in the last clip, but again, pay special attention to how he misses opportunities to use cover. He has the payload, he has this corner over here that he could be using, and how he instead just focuses on running straight at the enemy team.
What's up, bud?
So he was closing the gap towards the enemy team. Instead of abusing his range, instead of abusing cover, he just walked forward in a straight line, and the only thing that's stopping him is, intuition that maybe he's gone a little bit too far. But again, this sort of movement is what keeps a lot of players in fairly low ratings. He simply moves in a straight line, and it's very, very punishable. Alright, so I want to use the clips by this player to showcase two issues actually. So we previously talked about strafing, and I mentioned a very bad habit called WS strafing. This clip is a perfect example of WS strafing, and it is also another example of peak shooting not being used. Again, the reason why I prefer using Ashe clips for this is because peak shooting is arguably at its best, at its strongest in the hands of an Ashe player. Other characters that have faster firing rates or even continuous firing characters don't really see the benefits of peak shooting. So we can see that he went into a 1v1 against a McCree, and usually 1v1ing a McCree at this distance with a high ground advantage as Ashe should be in your favor. But in this case, the enemy McCree actually had an advantage. If he was more mechanically skilled, he would have ideally been able to win this 1v1, because if we looked at the movement, what this player did is he played right next to cover, and he was moving forwards and he was moving backwards instead of walking side to side using the cover to his left. I'm quickly going to let this run again. So right here we can see the cover right here that he could have been using. And again, it's just very, very risky to move like that. Alright, so this right here is again a clip by the same player. It's an issue that has manifested itself, and the issues are exactly the same as in the previous clip. So there's a whole lot of WS strafing, and he completely misses the opportunity to peek strafe using the corner right next to him. So he comes back to recontest, and in this case what he should do ideally is abuse this ledge here, abuse this corner, and just abuse peak shooting as much as possible in order to make himself a difficult target to hit. But the player unfortunately doesn't do that, and he instead decides to just focus on WS strafing, which doesn't do anything. So this sort of movement is just very ineffective, very risky, very easily punishable, and it's a habit that unfortunately a lot of players have in their gameplay.
In a previous episode on time, I addressed aiming drills. One of the major downsides I mentioned was a lack of authenticity, and I want to explain that in a bit more depth here. One of the most common pieces of advice when it comes to movement is that you should aim to move as unpredictably as possible. And that statement is 100% correct. But that doesn't mean that achieving unpredictable movement is easy. Let's do a little experiment to better understand what I mean. Here's a metronome. It represents your firing rate with a character like McCree, Reaper, or Zenyatta. Use your right index finger to tap on a desk in that rhythm. Make sure that you're keeping the rhythm. If you are tapping too early, your shot wouldn't fire. If you tap too late, then your damage output is lower than it could be. While you are doing that, use your left hand to tap the desk, alternating between your index finger and your middle finger in a random pattern. Try doing that for around 20 to 30 seconds. You can rewatch this clip and mute my voice to focus on that. There are three things that can happen. A, your right index finger either slows down or stops altogether as you focus on keeping the time between taps on your left hand completely random. B, your left hand will tap faster and faster. Or C, your left hand will tap in the rhythm of your right hand. Being truly random with your movement is difficult, especially during high-pressure situations. If you go into the practice range and try shooting at the targets while strafing, you will notice that landing your shots while trying to keep your movement as random and unpredictable as possible will be fairly difficult. Depending on the person, we tend to automatically make one of two changes. Some players increase the frequency of their strafe. The bigger the difference between your strafing rate and your firing rate, the easier it is to keep them apart. If you are trying to play an instrument at 120 beats per minute and someone else is clapping at 140 beats per minute, you will have a difficult time staying in your rhythm and ignoring the other person's clapping. But if you are playing an instrument at 120 beats per minute, while your friend claps at 500 beats per minute, you'll have no trouble ignoring it and focusing on your own rhythm. His clapping is so fast that it's difficult to even consider it a rhythm. It starts to sound like noise. It's the same with strafing. If you are strafing fast enough, then it'll become easier to ignore it when you are trying to aim. But it'll also be easier for the enemy to ignore it. And at those speeds, any randomness in your movement would be negligible. The second natural response to your own unpredictable movement screwing over your aim is to lose the randomness and fall into a rhythm. One common phenomenon with McCree players, for example, is that they strafe in rhythm with their shots. Same with other heroes like Ana or Ashe. This makes aiming much easier, as we are firing our shots whenever we change directions. But it also makes your movement incredibly predictable. Top tier players can maintain unpredictable movement while still landing their shots without subconsciously increasing their strafing speed or falling into a rhythm. But the majority of players are not top tier players. And even then, most professional players usually don't bother keeping a completely random pattern. The majority of players, even all the way up into the 4000 and above skill rating ranges, cannot stop themselves from strafing in a rhythm during very demanding situations. There's too much stuff going on, so they can't consciously keep track of their movement to make sure it's random. And that's one of the main problems with aiming drills. The bots tend to move completely randomly, which is extremely difficult for actual players to do. As mentioned before, head into a custom game as McCree and try to land your shots while maintaining a random strafing pattern that is not so ridiculously fast that you're essentially vibrating. You will immediately notice how difficult landing shots becomes. So most aiming drills, with their extremely unpredictable movement, completely prevents you from learning one of the most crucial aiming skills: assessing an opponent's strafe pattern. Since the majority of players strafe rhythmically, that means that you can catch onto that rhythm, which makes landing shots much easier since you know when the opponent will change directions. This skill is completely lost when practicing against bots with completely unpredictable strafes. At that point, you are practicing your ability to react to a direction change, which is helpful of course, but there is only so much you can do about your reaction time. Most of it comes from your genetics. What you can work on, however, is your ability to predict movement. Learning how to predict the enemy's movement, while also controlling your own movement in a way that doesn't make aiming significantly more difficult, has significant effects on someone's ability to aim. Raw aiming skill is important when it comes to landing your shots. If you can't get your crosshair where you want it to be, you'll have a difficult time. But understanding movement properly, both enemy movement and your own, and accepting that neither you nor the opponent will always have perfectly unpredictable movement, will make aiming significantly easier.
Alright, so this clip is not necessarily a great example of movement, but I wanted to use it for this topic in order to show you what actual, genuine, random movement looks like. So you can ask yourself the question, is this really how my opponents move in the games that they're playing? So it's a clip by a Zenyatta player. It's not a super high level clip, so I'm not going to focus too much on that, but just focus on how he moves. Right, so we can see that there is no clear rhythm to his movement. He even implements a couple freezes, which is again something we're going to talk about later, where he just stops moving altogether. And having this sort of movement and being able to move like this consistently in a team fight while also preserving your accuracy is very difficult. In this situation, the Zenyatta player was under a lot of pressure, which means that his main priority here wasn't landing shots. He essentially focused entirely on just staying alive and making his movement as difficult as possible. And in 90% of the situations during your fights, if not even more, the enemy simply won't move as random as this player does here. So let's again take a very quick look. Right, short freezes, fast strafes, slow strafes, changing directions, another freeze. It happens sometimes, but the majority of situations are going to consist of the enemy simply strafing in a set pattern, in a set rhythm, which is easy to read with a little bit of practice and can have very, very profound effects on your accuracy once you learn how to implement that into your thought process as you focus on aiming.
Jumping, for no good reason, is the most common bad habit in the game, if not first-person shooters in general. Jumping in of itself is not bad, but it's extremely situational. Let's first address when jumping is acceptable. The main use for jumping is as a way to reposition yourself primarily. Getting up ledges, reaching high ground, overcoming obstacles. Another use for jumping is with abilities that require you to jump, obviously, including Hanzo's lunge, Genji's double jump and wall climb, or Lucio's wall riding, amongst others. But jumping outside of abilities that are specifically designed for it, like Hanzo's lunge, is not an effective way of making yourself a more difficult target to hit. The only exception to that is corner jumping. If you are in a Widowmaker duel, for example, the enemy Widowmaker might place her crosshair where your head will be when you peek. Corner jumping just means that you jump before peeking the corner. This way you will still be slightly mid-air when you peek, lifting your head higher than expected, which can bait the enemy Widowmaker in landing a body shot instead of a headshot, which buys you the time to land a headshot yourself. It's a juke, and with any juke, it loses its effectiveness if it's used repeatedly, and it can fail if the enemy Widowmaker predicts it and aims slightly higher. The preferred method of baiting out a shot is shoulder peeking. You move around the corner, but quickly change directions before your head peeks out of cover. The enemy Widowmaker might end up firing her shot upon seeing your shoulder, not expecting you to switch directions this early. This gives you a small window of opportunity to actually peek and land a shot. But enough of Widowmaker duel techniques. Let's get back to jumping. The main problem with jumping is that it takes away control of your character outside of using your abilities to move, like Tracer's blink, Genji's double jump, or Winston's leap. Once you jump, you can't really change your mind until you land. So if you accidentally jump around a corner in front of 3 opponents, you're staring death in its face, not being able to quickly get behind cover because your feet haven't touched the ground yet. But, thanks to the fundamental movement transaction, this also makes aiming easier to a certain extent, since you are making yourself an easier target. But you can achieve the same effect by adjusting your movement without jumping. The only difference is that by jumping, you are losing control of your character. Moving in a straight line is a better way of making aiming easier in an engagement, since you remain in control of your character at all times. Now, I know what you're thinking. But I see pro players jump around on their streams all the time. Are you telling me that pro players have bad movement? The answer is yes, but also no. Unless the player in question is jumping for one of the reasons I mentioned, chances are that his jumping is bad movement. This doesn't mean that the pro player doesn't know how to move, however. The reality is that the main reason professional players jump is the same reason a lot of people jump in games. It's just a fun habit. When crossing long distances, like walking from Manethil to Stormwind in World of Warcraft, or the second point of Hanamura, back to the first, just holding W can be a bit boring for antsy players. They spam their jump key. It's fidgeting, nothing more. That builds into a habit that reveals itself when a player isn't really trying super hard and just wants to have a bit of fun. If you see Kabaji playing on a gold account, he's jumping around because he knows that he doesn't have to try super hard. He's trying to enjoy himself. If you are watching an Overwatch League player jump a lot in his streams, try to watch his POV in an Overwatch League match, and you will see that the frequency of their jumps goes down significantly, since they are fully focused on performing as best as they can. The only reason they would jump is overconfidence. Overall, jumping has its uses, but it's important that you are aware of the consequences jumping has, how it makes your movement more predictable, and how it takes away control of your character temporarily.
Alright, so this is one of the best examples that I could find for a player that just loves jumping, and he probably doesn't even think about it. It's just a very subconscious, automatic kind of second nature thing that's, just a habit that's been built. But just take a look at this clip and focus on how much he actually jumps. Right, there is no reason for him to be hopping around like this. Wherever he goes, he just jumps and he jumps and he jumps and he jumps. And It's even a little nauseating to watch, to be honest, but it's just a very, very bad habit to have, and it makes him a much, much easier target to hit. All the enemy team has to do is wait until he jumps, and they are going to be able to very accurately predict his trajectory over the next half second or so. And that just, again, makes it very difficult for the enemy team to hit him. He's just a very easy target, and as Zenyatta, you already have a very large hitbox, you don't have a lot of mobility, his team doesn't have a Lucio. Jumping is the last thing that he should be doing in this situation. It just, again, it makes him very, very easy to kill. Another thing that I wanted to address, not just for this clip, but also for other clips, even though the player doesn't directly get punished for his bad habits during this game, I want you to mainly focus on the negative effects that his behavior has, and the fact that while he maybe didn't get punished in this particular clip for the bad habit, there are situations where he does, and it's something that is going to affect your overall trajectory as you try to climb the ranked ladder. Alright, so this is a player that should be familiar to you. This is the same soldier player and actually the same round and map that we looked at earlier for the pathing example, where he wasn't disengaging from a Reaper properly. And the reason why I wanted to show you this clip in particular from that same player is because movement issues rarely come alone. Usually if a player has one very, very bad habit when it comes to moving, in the last case, you know, the pathing, usually other issues follow suit as well. So in this situation, his team is pushing in, he's finally made it through the choke, and he starts moving his way towards the point, but for one, he jumps around like a madman, and he doesn't strafe at all. And both of those aren't things that he gets punished for in this clip in particular, but they have very, very negative effects throughout multiple competitive matches. So this is where he reaches the point. Ideally, he should just take a couple steps backwards so that he has the cover over here to his left that he can hide behind because someone was on that side of the map. And then once he stands there, he should just focus on strafing, making himself as difficult of a target to hit as possible, especially since in this situation, our player is already kind of low HP, but he doesn't do that. Instead, he jumps in a straight line towards the edge of the map. And this is a relatively minor example of jumping and a lack of strafing, but it's something that we need to take into account because it's very, very easy for higher ranked players to punish this sort of movement, and it could cost the player a team fight in a future match if he gets picked and his team lacks the pressure and the enemy team comes back from spawn, and all of a sudden a free team fight win turned into a competitive loss. Alright, so this is one of my favorite examples of good movement and unnecessary movement in Overwatch that I've seen so far. It is a lot to digest, but I'm going to try to take it through this, step by step. So in this case, Taimo's playing Widowmaker and he's attacking, and he just got resurrected and he gets ambushed by Birdring, who is on Tracer. And I'm first going to go into Taimo's movement because it's a little bit simpler. You can see that one of the things he's going to do is he's going to start his scoping animation, but before he scopes in, he's going to jump so he can go around the corner while scoped and jumping. So this is, jump peeking. It is a fairly traditional Widowmaker technique that has its benefits, as I said previously, but this is one of those situations where doing this is completely unnecessary. So right here, you can see it, that's the first one, and that's the second one. In this situation, it just doesn't do anything, and honestly, this is just a habit that Taimo has built, which is why he's doing it. There is no real objective benefit to jump peeking a Tracer in this situation. But what's more interesting is I want to use this as an example of near perfect movement by Birdring, where he really uses almost all of the concepts that we talked about in this video so far. So I'm going to let this clip play from the start. So the first thing he does, it's very difficult to see, but he is not only strafe spamming, he's also crouch spamming. So he goes side to side, but he also goes up and down, which is very, very strong against a Widowmaker because Taimo, if he doesn't land a headshot, then chances are Birdring can simply recall or he can blink out of corner if his reaction speed is quick enough. But by strafing and by crouch spamming, he makes it very, very difficult for Taimo to keep track of his head visually again. Look at this. There we go. It was very, very slow. Very, very quick, rather. After that, he goes around the corner and he makes sure to peek with his blinks, which is, again, very, very brilliant. So he knows that if Birdwing knows that if he were to just walk around the corner, then Taimo could simply place his crosshair where the head is going to be, and all he has to do is click left click. What Birdwing tries to do instead is he peeks the corner by blinking, which means that Taimo cannot predict where he's going to show up. Maybe his blink is going to end up here, maybe it's going to end up all the way over here, which makes it very, very difficult for the Widowmaker to land a shot. There we go. So he went for the blink, and you can see that Taimo actually tried to predict this. So he moved his crosshair to the right, thinking, okay, he's going to blink around the corner, he's going to be right here. However, after the blink, Birdwing is actually over here. So he jumped and he went for a blink, and this forces Taimo to, if he wants to land the shot, go for a very, very large flick. And the larger the flick, the more difficult it becomes to land. So again, Birdwing is using his movement to make it very, very difficult for Taimo to land this shot. And then after that, just some more traditional, strafing. And here is another very strong pathing example where Birdwing, he probably ran out of blinks, I assume, and he needs to get back around the corner. And what he does is he turns his back around and he goes back to the whole strafing and crouch spamming to make it even more difficult for Taimo to land that shot. So he just had to wait like half a second maybe to get his blink back. He probably went in with too few blinks. So turn around, strafe, crouch, and then blink around the corner. Then after that, this is another technique where he crouches and he goes around the corner slowly in order to try and bait the Widowmaker in wasting shots. So let me go back a little and see if I can pause it. If Birdwing peeks like that, this is very difficult to pause. If Birdwing peeks like this, it means that his head is going to be lower than Taimo would expect it, because if he was standing up straight, then it would be over here. And generally speaking, enemies don't really expect you to peek the corner while crouching. Now, the reason why that is because peeking a corner while crouching is generally very bad because your movement speed is lowered a lot, which makes it much more difficult for you to correctly time it. But in this case, he's using it as a technique to keep his movement unpredictable and to surprise Taimo, and in order to waste Taimo's shot, which is again just very, very strong. After that, he goes for another blink peek. So in this case, the flick is even larger, right? He is off the screen, which means that Taimo essentially has to do an off-screen flick, and landing off-screen flicks on a target as small as Tracer is very, very difficult. Even if you're an incredibly talented player, it is borderline impossible to execute these shots consistently. So overall, Birdwing's movement in this clip was just phenomenal. Taimo himself was also very surprised, and I really consider this clip to be the golden standard of movement as Tracer, because I personally cannot think of anything that Birdwing could have done better here. He was essentially doing everything correct. He was strafing, he was pathing, he was crouch spamming, he was peeking properly. This was just beautiful to watch.
Now that we are aware of all the downsides that jumping brings with it, let's talk about the alternative, crouching. The effect that crouching has is very similar to jumping, in that it puts your head where the enemies don't normally expect it. But it has one major downside. Unlike jumping, crouching lowers your movement speed. So you cannot crouch for extended periods of time because it will make you an easier target to hit instead of a more difficult one. So if we want to crouch, we can only tap crouch. First, I strongly recommend everyone watching this video to head into their game settings to make sure that they are not using a toggle crouch keybind. If you are toggling your crouch on and off, you will have a very difficult time tap crouching, since you'll need twice the keystrokes for the same movement, slowing down your tap crouches. Here's a little comparison. I used the crouch key the same amount of times in both clips, but in one, I am clearly moving much more erratically. Tap crouching is exactly what you think it is. You quickly tap the crouch key. This makes you crouch for a very brief period of time and then lifts you back up. You are crouching for such a small window of time that the slowed down movement is actually barely noticeable. Of course, you don't want to tap so fast that the crouching animation doesn't even start. A friend can help you in a custom game to get the right duration of the crouch down. But what are the benefits of tap crouching? Our head hitbox doesn't really move for very long. For 99% of the engagement, it'll still be at its default position, so the enemy can ignore it. But that's not what tap crouching is actually about. Tap crouching isn't primarily about hitbox manipulation. Tap crouching is about making it more difficult to track your head visually. When strafing side to side, characters completely change their animation. To make sure that the animation doesn't stutter, the transition is smooth. That's why, as you strafe faster and faster, your character doesn't just flash all over the place as it's switching animations constantly. Instead, it smoothly transitions between animations. This is called interpolation for all of you interested. It's looking at 2 frames of different animations and calculates what a frame right between those 2 would look like. If you change directions too quickly, then you barely enter the second animation. So when we strafe, our character's animation changes constantly, which already makes us more difficult to track. But the same applies with crouching as well. Although the crouch animation is much faster and more responsive than the strafing animation. Even if you crouch very briefly, your character moves around a whole lot. If you add the crouch animation on top of the animation of changing directions during a strafe, your character becomes very difficult to track visually. And if the enemy can't properly keep track of your head's position on the screen, he will have a more difficult time hitting it. Strafing and crouch spamming is the most effective way of dodging shots in a one-on-one. It actually breaks the fundamental movement transaction a little. Crouch spamming is more annoying to the enemy than it is to you, since the animation is more sluggish in the third person than in the first person. So the increase in elusiveness is higher than the increase in difficulty landing shots.
Okay, so this clip is, again, a little bit more of a funny one, and it is also a very, very old clip. But again, movement is very fundamental skill. I could go back to clips of the game's release, where all of these movement techniques have been used. And honestly, even games from the early 2000s, these movement techniques were still the same there. So let's take a look at this and focus on Defran, the enemy soldier. As we can see, it's absolutely ridiculous. So he's using a mixture of crouch spamming, weaving in a few sprints, but mostly just strafing and crouch spamming in order to make it very, very difficult for IDDQD, who is the Widowmaker player in this situation, to actually land a headshot. And because this is, I know it looks ridiculous, but that's really what it's about. Not only is he strafing very quickly, he's also crouch spamming. And just try to lock onto his head in this clip. Like, zoom into the video, make your browser as large as you can, focus on his head and just try to keep track of it visually. As you can see, it is ridiculously difficult. Now, was it really necessary by Defran to do this? Probably not. He could have just walked around the corner and he would have been fine. But in this case, he lost his Reinhardt, so he doesn't really have any cover to play around, and he just wanted to get a little bit of extra damage in, maybe get a pick to try and trade for the Reinhardt. But again, the reason why he was peeking there and why he didn't go back sooner is something that I'm going to address more in a later topic. In this situation, the main thing to focus on is just his movement being incredibly annoying to deal with. Keep in mind, it is not unpredictable, right? So focus on his movement, and you can see that there's a very clear rhythm. Right, so technically you can predict the movement, but even if you can, simply dealing with the difficulty of tracking him visually is very difficult to handle. So let's take a look at the next clip, because it is another Tracer player who is using multiple movement techniques at once. Again, I mentioned earlier that people with one bad movement habit are usually accompanied by a lot of other bad movement habits. But on the other hand, players that have a few very good movement habits tend to have an easier time picking up the others and making those good habits as well. So whenever I'm showing an example, in this case, this example is meant to showcase strafing properly. It is unavoidable that the players also showcase very good strafing, very good pathing, etc. So in this case, the enemy tracer is running away from the McCree, and without even seeing the enemy tracer's perspective, we can tell that the enemy tracer has run out of blinks, because if she didn't, then there was no reason for her to stay in that next room. But she's combining multiple techniques here, which is wonderful. So for one, strafing, crouch spamming, and if we look at the pathing, at one moment the enemy tracer is actually turning around and lowering her head just to buy herself some extra time. And doing this, so it's a little bit difficult to see, I'm sorry for the quality, but in this frame right here, the enemy tracer is facing in this direction, is strafing left to right, and is crouch spamming. So in this situation, it is essentially impossible for the McCree to land a headshot. Not entirely impossible, but very, very unlikely rather. And the movement overall just makes it very, very difficult for the McCree to really deal with the tracer. And this buys the tracer enough time to eventually blink around and then take the fight against the McCree, right? Instead of just shooting the McCree, because if she was just strafing regularly and shooting at the McCree, she would have had a much, much more difficult time dealing with him.
We talked about strafing, pathing, jumping, and crouching. There's only one movement option remaining, or, well, the lack thereof. Freezing up, or simply standing still, is one of the most misunderstood and underutilized movement options in the game. As mentioned previously, players instinctively want to stay on the move without really understanding why, which causes all the negative side effects, the rhythmic strafing, the WS strafing, and also moving when you don't have to. Standing still is the best way to make landing shots easier. If you don't have any reason to worry about getting shot, then you have no reason to move. The point behind movement is to make ourselves more difficult to hit at the expense of our own accuracy. But if there's no one trying to hit us, we don't need to sacrifice accuracy at all. We can stand still, which makes aiming easier. The only movement option that makes aiming easier than standing still is mirror strafing, which is an incredibly difficult technique that even high-level players can't consistently pull off in very high-intensity situations. And the problem with mirror strafing is that unless it's perfect and you are completely lined up with the enemy's movement, its effects can be more damaging than they are helpful. A bad mirror strafe is worse than standing still when it comes to ease of landing shots. Standing still puts us into the Overwatch equivalent of a single pendulum. The only variable we need to assess and predict is the enemy's movement, which in most situations is fairly simple, as players tend to fall into a predictable rhythm unless they consciously think about it. So, if you are playing Widowmaker behind an Orisa barrier on high ground and you are confident that no one on the enemy team can shoot you, stop moving around. Stand still, take a deep breath, shoot. If you are on a flank trying to get a one-shot on someone as Roadhog or Hanzo, stand still, focus, and land your shot. Don't wiggle all over the place when you don't have to. Do not sacrifice your accuracy for increased elusiveness when you are confident no one can or wants to shoot at you. A variation of freezing is stutter stepping. It's mostly used in duels, but the results can be very surprising. As the name implies, instead of strafing side to side, we add a third movement. Not at all. Instead of going right, left, we add freeze. This allows us to mix and match. Left, freeze, right, freeze, left, right. Much more difficult to predict, but it can also backfire if your freezes become predictable. It's a viable strategy, but use it with caution. It could cause the exact opposite effect if you don't use it properly.
There we go. Again, you have seen this player before. I've used him for some examples previously, and I actually want to thank him. So this is Von Gales, and he is one of my clients. And as I was producing this episode, I actually had a session with him. And of course, I saw that movement was a very big issue for him. So after the session, I straight away asked him, hey, I'm making this episode on movement. Would you be fine with me, using this, using some of your examples? And he said, sure, if it can help other people, then I'm all for it. So again, big thanks to Von Gales for allowing me to use his clips. This right here is a bad example of a player not correctly using freezing. So he goes on a flank, and I'm not going to address his positioning or anything, but I want you to focus on how little threat he is under and how much he moves despite that. So we can see that he is consistently moving, making it very, very difficult for him to land shots, right? He's strafing, going all over the place, but there's no pressure. There are no opponents anywhere. There's no reason for him to believe that an opponent is flanking because he just won a team fight. In this case, the Zarya and the Reinhardt just came out of spawn, and all he has to focus on there is just standing still, landing his shots. Once he sees an opponent, then he can start moving again to make himself a more difficult target to hit. And as mentioned before, ideally he should be peek shooting as well, so he can utilize either this room over here, and he can peek shoot in and out of it, or if we go a little bit further back, he can even use this corner right here to peek shot around from. But in this situation, neither of those are necessary until the enemy team actually regroups properly. In this case, a Reinhardt and a Zarya were dropping from high ground. He's under no pressure, he's under no danger, and he's missing multiple shots on the Zarya that he could have landed very easily, because the enemy Zarya, as we can see here, she is in the middle of the air because she got booped, which makes her trajectory very, very predictable. But he is making it very difficult for himself to land these shots because he keeps moving, again, even though there's no reason to move around. Alright, so this is a different Ashe player, but this is again a great example of where freezing would have been hugely beneficial to the player, but instead he was moving around when really there was no reason to. So he's playing this high ground, and he sees that an enemy Ashe is going to come around from the left side in a moment. There we go. And we can see that the enemy Ashe hasn't spotted him. If the enemy Ashe would have spotted him, we could clearly see that her gun and that her face was facing, towards us. But we can see that the enemy Ashe is actually facing in this direction, which means she hasn't spotted our Ashe player yet. So in this situation, our Ashe player needs to recognize that he hasn't been spotted yet and stand still and just focus on landing that first headshot. And then after that, the 1v1 is essentially won, but he doesn't do that. He just makes life very difficult, and he misses 3 shots in a row, 4 shots, 5 shots. He does eventually manage to get the kill, but this could have turned out very, very badly. All he had to do here was abuse the fact that the Ashe didn't notice him until he started shooting and just stand still. Again, perfect example of where freezing could have dramatically lowered the risk of a one-on-one engagement. Right, there we go. We obviously look at this game quite often, but it just has a lot of really good examples that I can use. This is an example, unlike the previous one, where a player was not freezing even though he shouldn't have. In this case, this player was freezing even though he shouldn't have. He should have been moving instead. So let's take a look at this. So he drops down from high ground, and at this point he's playing in front of the choke. I'm not going to address the fact that he's not playing with his team, which is dangerous in of itself, especially if his teammates have a shield. But I just want you to focus on how he stops moving even though he is exposed to multiple opponents. And doing this against a damage boosted McCree who is playing right in front of him is a very, very dangerous game to play. So in this case, he doesn't directly get punished for it. But if that McCree would have landed a headshot, maybe a follow-up, maybe someone else would have hit him, this could have resulted in a pick. And his team just regrouped, which means that if he would have died here, that would have just wasted a lot of his team's time. They would wait for him to respawn. During that time, maybe someone else gets picked, and just ends up in this endless circle of trickling. And if you want to really climb out of these ratings, you need to make sure that you move and position properly in order to lower the chance of you getting picked while your team is regrouping. And especially if you're playing with a Reinhardt and a Brigitte player and a Zarya player, you have a lot of tools that your teammates have that you can use in order to make yourself more difficult to kill, in order to make it more difficult for the enemy team to pick you. But if you are peeking enemies without strafing, then you are making it very, very difficult for your teammates to regroup properly, because you're going to get picked a lot just because of the movement alone. Alright, so this is a clip by Arg, or however you pronounce it. I'm super sorry. He's actually an excellent streamer, and he also does some really great educational content on Hanzo on YouTube, so I really, really recommend checking him out. But in this case, I'm sorry, Argy, but I couldn't care less about what you're doing. I actually care about what the enemy Widowmaker is doing. And this clip it's brilliant. It's hilarious. But the enemy Widowmaker is using freezing beautifully to mess with Argy's head, and it works very, very well. So it's a mix of rhythm strafing, it's a mix of freezing, and again, I know it's a little bit difficult to see on this clip, but especially once the enemy Widowmaker gets damage boosted by the Orisa supercharger, it becomes a little bit easier to see her. But just focus on how she tries to time her freezes with his shots. So she freezes, Arge is putting his crosshair on her, and then just before he's about to fire, she starts moving. And this is also one of the reasons why Hanzo is usually a character that is played at closer ranges. Right? You would think of Hanzo as kind of a sniper that you want to play at a long distance with, but the problem with any projectile weapon is that as distance increases, at a certain point it becomes impossible for you to land shots because the enemy team has enough time between you firing your shot and the shot actually landing that they can simply dodge, and that is exactly what the enemy Widowmaker is abusing here. She freezes, and when she sees that the shot is coming, she starts moving, and it becomes impossible for Arge to hit his shots here, and it's phenomenal to watch, and eventually just starts spamming and he lands a couple shots, but he is just wasting so much time here. And the only solution to this, of course, is to actually get closer and get into a position where the traveling speed of your projectiles is not as big of a hindering factor, but fair play to you. He took it like a champ. He was getting outplayed super hard, and I think he was a little bit stubborn about it. He should have probably just swapped to another target, but at least he kept the Widowmaker busy for the entire fight, so the play wasn't entirely bad. But again, that was just a very, very, very entertaining and very good example by the enemy Widowmaker.
WASD aiming is one of the worst mechanical habits one can have. Luckily, it's something you rarely see in players outside of bronze or silver ratings. But since it affects quite a large chunk of the player base nonetheless, it's important for me to address it. WASD aiming is when a player stops using their mouse and relies exclusively on using the WASD keys to get the enemy into his or her crosshair. Aiming and movement go hand in hand. You use your mouse to get the crosshair to where you want it to be, and you use your movement to minimize how much your target moves around on the screen at any given moment in time. The problem with WASD aiming is that it's trying to mix both of those functions into your movement alone. The reason this habit is usually present in lower ranked players is because they don't have a lot of gaming experience. This mostly happens in players who are new to video games in general. They struggle using both hands for different purposes at the same time. One is moving around a mouse, the other one is pressing keys. It seems trivial to most of us, but for some players, quite a few actually, that alone is a big challenge to overcome. So they instinctively resort to WASD aiming. Moving both their character and their mouse at the same time is tough, so they end up using only one of the two. They either stop moving entirely, even though they are under enemy fire, or they stop using their mouse entirely, trying to move the enemy character into their crosshair using the WASD keys. There are multiple disadvantages to WASD aiming, of course. If you suffer from WASD aiming, you should do what musicians do when learning new pieces. One hand at a time first. This is one of these situations where aim trainers can be incredibly useful. Simply use a workshop mode like PMA Jelly's aim practice or whatever is available to you at the moment, and start shooting targets while remaining stationary. Once you feel comfortable with that, begin to slowly integrate movement while shooting. It'll be really tough at first, but it's a necessary step if you want to find competitive success. Once you feel comfortable using both your movement keys and your mouse at the same time, you can ditch the aim trainers and use free-for-all to warm up both your movement and your aim at the same time against real people.
Alright, so one of the problems with WASD aiming is that it's only really seen in very lower ranks, and it is fairly difficult to get public VODs that I can use for these videos, right? Because obviously I have bronze clients, but I can't just use the footage of my bronze clients without asking them first. But luckily, this is a public VOD that has actually been submitted for VOD review, which means that I can use it, of a fairly low-ranked Tracer player. And it's not a perfect example of WASD aiming, but it is an example of WASD aiming. So let's have a look. I need you to pay special attention to how this player moves his crosshair very, very little at certain times. He's not actually using his mouse a whole lot. He is mainly using his movement in order to try and keep his crosshair close to the enemies. So right there you can see how he was, when he dropped from the high ground, instead of simply moving his mouse to the left, he was moving to the left physically while his mouse wasn't moving at all. And then right here as well, very, very little mouse movement. He was just strafing forwards and to the left. And trying to mirror the enemy movement, again, is not always a bad thing, but in this situation, it makes his movement very predictable because the enemy Anima's movement is terrible. She's just moving in straight lines, which means that if we are using WASD aiming to hit her, we are mirroring her movement, which means that her terrible movement is now our terrible movement. And being Tracer and moving like this is just not a great idea. And it just makes it very, very difficult to land shots. And right here as well, he is putting his crosshair on the enemy Ana, but then he just strafes backwards and to the left to try and keep it on her. Right here, same thing, just strafes backwards to try and hit the Mei, and eventually he dies. I'm going to let that clip play again because it's just a perfect example of what I mean when I say you should not use your movement keys to aim. You need to use your movement keys to maybe, make aiming a little bit easier or make getting hit a little bit more difficult, but you need to use your mouse in order to actually get your crosshair on the enemy target.
I try to keep these guides as character and game agnostic as I can, meaning that no matter which first-person shooter or character you play, you'll be able to implement and apply the concepts and techniques I cover. But this time I have to be a bit more specific. I'll try to keep this section as short as possible. Genji's double jump makes jumping a much stronger movement option. Normally, jumping around a corner prevents you from adjusting your movement direction until you land. But Genji's second jump is completely independent of his previous jump, allowing you to jump around a corner and then back behind the corner before you land. Since you can adjust the timing of the second jump, it also makes your movement less predictable. You could use the second jump at the apex of the first jump, or closer to when you are about to hit the ground. This adds even more depth to your movement. On top of that, his second jump puts him in a really annoying animation that can be quite difficult to keep track of visually, giving you similar benefits to tap crouching. Lucio's wall riding increases his movement speed, which makes him more difficult to hit. But a wall riding Lucio also moves in a very predictable trajectory, so overall wall riding tends to make you an easier target to hit than a more difficult one compared to strafing and crouch spamming. But it allows you to reposition quickly, and it allows you to gain height, which allows you to get the jump on people and forces the enemy team to stare into the sky if they want to shoot you, drastically handicapping their situational awareness. Lucio wall riding is incredibly complex. We could talk about it for more than an hour, but we don't have the time, unfortunately. Baptiste's jump is also unique in its height, but it really behaves like a traditional jump. It's just useful in more situations. Use it to easily gain access to high ground, and be careful about using it in front of the enemy team, as it puts you into a predictable trajectory that makes it easier for the enemy team to shoot you. That's all there is to it. Tracer's blinks are some of the strongest defensive tools in the game if used properly. They allow you to move while jumping, making jumping as Tracer a slightly less bad habit than on other characters. They allow you to force the enemy team to make large turns to reacquire you visually, which can prevent them from aiming. They allow you to quickly reposition during a fight to get behind the enemy team before your team is set up, so your team doesn't accidentally get into a 5v6 before you can get yourself in position, while also allowing you to get back to the fight quickly after dying in case the fight hasn't ended yet. Similar to Lucio's wall ride, there are a lot of things you can do with your blink. Multiple combos, ways to traverse the map, different juke techniques, but I won't go into those super in-depth. At its most basic use, you use it to dodge enemy abilities, blink circles around the enemy to slow down their aiming, and to get yourself behind the enemy team to apply increased pressure.
Okay, so this clip is, again, another clip by Kabaji. He is on Tracer this time instead of Soldier, and it is a great example of how to use your blinks to juke opponents, right? So he moves up here, and he sees the enemy McCree, and as soon as he sees the McCree, it's very quick, so I'm going to replay this. As soon as he's going to see the McCree, he is going to anticipate the flashbang, and he's going to use his blinks in order to juke and actively dodge the enemy flashbang in order to increase his chances of winning this duel. There we go. It's very quick. It's something that it looks a lot more difficult than it actually is. Really, what it just comes down to is, oh, there's a McCree. I didn't see him use his flashbang, so I'm just going to, blink. And usually the timing that players have on when they would flashbang and when they would blink is fairly instinctual, so it's not too difficult to predict when an enemy McCree is going to flashbang. He usually does it very early, and then just a quick double blink in order to take the 1v1 without having to worry about the flashbang.
Doomfist is very unique when it comes to movement. You don't do a whole lot of pathing as Doomfist, as most of your mobility during fights comes from abilities. You don't have to strafe a lot, since most of your time is spent in fixed animations. The only time you really move around freely on the ground as Doomfist during a fight is when you run out of cooldowns, and you don't really want to be under enemy fire without your cooldowns to begin with. Doomfist's movement is very unique, so don't get frustrated if you try to get better at him, but your fundamental movement skills don't transition properly. Similar to Lucio, Mercy's movement is also very unique. While you strafe at times, your res puts you into a locked animation that prevents you from doing much besides turning to make your head more difficult to keep track of. You want to strafe whenever the enemy team starts shooting at you. But that's not a very common situation as Mercy, since you want to fly away using your Guardian Angel anyways to avoid enemy fire. As Mercy, you want to avoid exposing yourself to the enemy team, and you don't really have to most of the time in order to heal or damage boost your teammates. When you are exposed, you simply fly back to safety rather than strafing while keeping yourself exposed to the opponent unnecessarily. Mercy also has access to her super jump. There are plenty of tutorials out there that go into all the neat stuff you can do with Mercy's Guardian Angel, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it's something that every main support player has to research. Pharah is another unique case. You want to maximize your airtime, of course. Touching the ground as Pharah is not great in most situations. Being in the sky gives you a more effective angle to attack from, increases your pressure, and the added distance keeps you safe from characters with fall-off damage or shorter ranges, like Reaper, McCree, Tracer, Sombra, Soldier, or even Ashe. The main issue is that your movement becomes very sluggish. You can't change your direction as quickly as other characters mid-air, so you rely on peek shooting and cover as well. The primary cover for Pharah players are roofs and large walls. You usually have a Mercy pocket when you play Pharah, so that makes up for the downsides of your limited movement while airborne. And lastly, Widow hogshots. They are a bit of a power move, not really something you want to do in a Widow duel, as it makes you a fairly easy target to hit. But it can work, especially if the enemy isn't aware of your positioning. Hook up towards a wall, cancel the hook mid-animation by pressing the jump key, and you are on your way. It's great to reposition and can give you very unique angles to land shots from. It has its uses and it can give you some really flashy picks, especially against a Hanzo in a 1v1 using hook shots can be very effective. But be aware of the danger you are putting yourself in. You're not going to hit the ground anytime soon, so don't bother feeling any regret. It'll be too late anyways.
Alright, so this is a quick example of what rocket jumping looks like. This spot isn't super interesting in terms of movement in general, but it's just a good example of rocket jumping. So he's playing with his team, and the enemy Winston is about to go in with his primal. Everything fine so far. He almost gets knocked off the map, but he uses his sprint to keep himself on, and in order to, eventually escape the Winston, he runs over the health pack, and then right here, he rocket jumps. And the way that you rocket jump, again, there are a lot of guides on it, but just real quick, is you look at the ground, you shoot your rockets, and then in the space where your rockets have been fired, but they haven't detonated yet, it's a very small window that you have, You just press jump, and then the knockback from the rockets stacks on top of the momentum that you get from your jump, and you can jump over big gaps like this, and you can manage to stay alive.
Now, I could go into even more concepts like rocket jumping, but there are already plenty of resources out there that can teach you all about it. Overall, movement is one of the most fundamental skills that any FPS player needs to acquire. It's even more important than aim, since it not only affects your offensive capabilities, but also your defensive ones. No matter what first-person shooter you play, acquiring good movement is a skill that you'll benefit from throughout your entire gaming career, even if you end up switching to a different game. So putting some thought and time into it is well worth it. My name is ioStux's, and I'd like to thank you for learning.